Last Sunday, I think I tried to remind on Wednesday night, sent out a message on Friday of where we'll be. This morning, we'll talk about that in just a second. We will be utilizing some older technology as well as some newer technology in our class today. I'm going to try to write as largely and as brightly as I can, but I'll also encourage if you'd like to see stuff that's going to be going up on the board in a second. I'll talk more about the board and what we're doing with the board after Clint prays in a moment, but if you would like to get closer to maybe see some things that are coming on the board, I don't have any secret knowledge. I'm not going to put secret answers up there. This isn't going to be like some test after class. You have to copy everything down exactly. But just in case you would like to be closer, you're more than welcome to move up. We'll get into our class and be using all of our materials together this morning in just a second. But before we get started, let's frame our minds and think about what we're here for this morning. I'm going to ask Clint to lead us in prayer, if you would, please, brother. All right. I used to go down to northern Alabama to visit my grandparents, and I remember one morning getting ready to have breakfast. I'm pretty sure it was my grandmother was getting things ready, and she was getting her coffee ready, and she told me a story about a couple she knew, an older woman and an older man who'd been married for a long time, and one morning, as this older woman is getting breakfast ready for her husband, as she has for years now, she just kind of, I'm tired of this, and I want you to take on your responsibility. The husband was kind of like, whoa, what are you talking about? I'm making coffee and breakfast for you every day, and you're supposed to be the one making the coffee for us. In fact, it's in the Bible that you're supposed to be making the coffee for us. The husband said, what are you talking about? And she opened her Bible, and she said, Hebrews, right? I think, as my grandma told me that story, that might have been more of a joke more than a real story. But Hebrews is going to be our study and our focus for the next few months. I think we're going to go through January being in the book of Hebrews, the intention of working through these 13 chapters and working kind of more of a textual sense than maybe some of our more topical studies we've had recently on other things. So this morning, what I'd like to do for the first 20 to 25 minutes or so are to, as you've had a chance to read Hebrews, as I've been encouraging you to do so, I'm going to encourage you to do your best to actually not look at Hebrews for these first 20 minutes or so. What we'd like to do is just answer this question of what do we know about the book of Hebrews? This has two purposes for our class overall long term. We're thinking about the idea of any presuppositions we have, we want to go ahead and bring them to the board and make note of that and make record of that. I'm not going to strictly use the term inductive Bible study, but that's kind of some of the thought I have in my mind. So as we come to the book of Hebrews, we want to see what is Hebrews speaking and saying and draw the points and the evidence from the text rather than thinking, okay, Hebrews, I've read this before, so-and-so preached a sermon series about this, I already know what Hebrews says, and dumping things into the text. What we know about Hebrews very well might be biblically accurate and true and correct, but we want to be aware of those things in case some of our presuppositions are not exactly what the evidence is leading us to be able to make corrections. As well as this might be a class to say, as we're doing this as a group, but as a pool, you might think, well, I don't know a whole lot about Hebrews. And we'll spend the next 20 minutes or so filling up this board with various things that we know about the book. And then at the end of the 13 weeks, or at the end of these 13 chapters sometime in January, we won't do this whole exercise again, but we'll have this information available to us, and maybe we'll see there's been some growth and some knowledge and some increase of things we've learned over these past few months, starting from now through the month of January in this particular book. So just thinking about this question, I can tell you 99% of what you say is going to make it on this board this morning. As long as it's related to the Bible, related to the book of Hebrews, I think this, I remember this, I remember a passage, I think it's located in Hebrews, it's going to go up here today. And then, like I said, we'll see at the end of these 4 months, what have we learned and what are we seeing that's based and lined up with all of that. So, Clint, you read our prayer this morning, so we'll start with you. And we'll go, no, we're not going to go around the whole room, but we'll start with Clint this morning. What do we know about the book of Hebrews? Something?
The author's not clear.
All right, so at some point, we'll talk about author. What's your rule about spelling, Dan?
You can't spell more than one way. You're not a good speller.
And that's why I'm not an engineer, but I inherited that from my father. So as you say things this morning, as I'm having to write the word author in front of people, and I'm thinking, is that how you spell author? I promise I'm not trying to intentionally. You're more than welcome to correct me, but I'd maybe welcome that afterwards as well. The question about author, though, this is one of my favorite questions to do with the kids for suckers. I'll ask them who wrote Isaiah, and they'll say Paul, and I'll say who wrote Isaiah, and eventually they say Isaiah. I'll ask them who wrote Hebrews, and they say I don't know, and I say correct, and I give them a sucker. Now, there might be some discussions. We could talk about that more outside of our class, but we're going to keep this point in mind or just have that thought about Hebrews. What else do we know about Hebrews? Jeff?
Jesus is the perfect sacrifice.
You talked about sacrifice and priest, is that right? So those ideas, Jesus is obviously going to be a key central idea of all of this. What else do we know about Hebrews? Miss Rebecca?
It's Christ the superior in all things. You know the prophets, you know the angels, you know Moses, you know Aaron, you know Melchizedek. He is the ultimate. He's the Son of God.
Superior, or what are some of our other words that we might know from Hebrews that are related to superior? Better, best, greater. Those are some of the ideas that we're going to see Jesus is. Some of those studies about Hebrews are going to have Jesus is better, Jesus is superior, and that's going to be something we're going to notice about the text of Hebrews. Then angels, we'll go ahead and put Moses. Ms. Rebecca, you listed a couple of things. Moses, angels, prophets. The priesthood, I'm going to just kind of remind ourselves of that's going to be talked about within that regard. What else do we know about Hebrews? Tracy?
The chapter on faith, examples of great faith.
We'll talk about and come to see what is this chapter, what's the point of this chapter, and this chapter of faith. Remember that in there. Glenn, is that him?
This was written to Christians that were being persecuted, and so they were starting to go back to some of the Mosaical laws.
Persecution. There's a lot of talk about the law of Moses. Maybe an encouragement to return to that. We'll see from there. What else do you know about Hebrews? Back half of the class. Yes, ma'am.
And we have a better and new covenant.
Covenants are talked about. I'm going to put old versus new, and I don't mean that to be like this Saturday night, old covenant versus new covenant, throwing it down. We'll come to understand and talk about that through the text overall, but especially like chapters 8, 9, and 10. That point is made about something related to that, Ms. Rebecca?
There's ammunition against falling away or drifting away. More, a lot of warnings and a lot of education on let us draw near, let us look to. There's a lot of education and warning.
Warnings. Let us. So, because of the danger of drifting back to the law of Moses or leaving Christ, whatever way it might be. A big part of the letter is warning about don't do that. There's some sections in chapter 6 to think about where if you leave the faith, what could you possibly go to? To leave faith is just a very foolish decision, because what else could you go to find hope or security and peace in some way? Let's get some other voices for a bit. What else do we know about Hebrews? Maybe some passages that, I think that I remember at least this quote. I may not know the chapter in the book right now, or the chapter in the verse right now, but maybe verses that stick in our mind. Patrick?
God has spoken.
The idea that God has spoken there, and he has told us what we need to know.
He's spoken in his Son.
When I put that in parentheses, I'm not diminishing that. I'm just making that's the point that's made in chapter 1, kind of going back to the idea of Jesus being superior as well. Other voices? Other thoughts? Danny? Jesus is our high priest. We get that idea in there. That's absolutely true. Something else you were adding with that? No? Ms. Glenda?
It tells about the faith of some of the patriarchs that we have. Abraham's one of them.
Some of that faith that we learn about, talked about in there as well. What else do we know about the book of Hebrews? Remember, Jeff?
That Jesus was made perfect as our high priest by becoming a person.
You got it right there in the left.
Well, we got the priest, but we got the idea of,
Perfect right next to it.
and perfect as well.
Well, what I think is that God is perfect, but he wasn't the perfect person to be sympathetic to the people without becoming
His humanity.
Right. I was trying to figure out the one word to wrap that up. Thank you. The humanity of Jesus is talked about and related to this, and kind of really this overall as well. You ever made a birthday card and you handwrite it and you start out and you write happy and you like the first 3 letters are huge, and then you realize, wow, I messed up. I got my first 4 points really big, and good luck, Miss Jerry, trying to get our bottom corner over there. Miss Rebecca, you've had your hand up for a little bit, and then we'll get to Don.
And I made me think that, I don't know if you think about too much, it's just the way it starts. It's almost like a trumpet blowing. It starts out with God. That's such a emphatic beginning. Every one that's emphatic like that in Genesis, in the beginning, God. Now, there are other prophets where it says the Lord said, but this one just comes right out, catches your attention immediately. God. And that's a profound, right there, to grab your attention. I was just impressed with that story. I think most translations start with the word God. Some will start with, in the past, God. But certainly God is the first,
It's right there at the beginning of this.
very beginning.
Right. Before we get to Don, you're up on deck. When we think about Hebrews, what genre, what section of Scripture are we in? We're in the New Testament. We sometimes refer to it as an epistle or a letter. I'm not going to deny that, but the way that it starts out isn't necessarily letter-like. Some people have kind of, and this is using some of the things that we have today, almost talked about Hebrews being kind of like a tract. It's almost like a sermon that's printed out for people. You get a little bit of epistle-like stuff at the very end of the like the very, very end of the letter, if we're going to call it that. But it's very much like a sermon in what it's doing there. So we're going to at least put that, and the idea that it's addressed to Hebrew Christians and wanting to write to them in some way. Don, go ahead. Blood is a key thing. You get talk about blood a lot. I've got my going red for blood like I've got red for warning. That's our sacrifices. What else do we know about Hebrews? I'm trying to think of maybe some more texts. And again, as I'm trying to encourage you to not be flipping through Hebrews, be like, oh yeah, I remember this because you're looking at it right now. Some more things that we think about, some more passages in our minds with Hebrews. Thinking about a sword.
Hebrews 4, 12.
What's the the message in there? What's the...
The word of God is always the background, so when you hear the Son, and the Holy Spirit is not there, and the Son also in that story.
Some other things we've already got up here. We've talked about our high priest. That's also around there in chapter 4. Probably remember faith from chapter 11. What else do we know about Hebrews, or things we think about with Hebrews? We got, Glenn, was that a hand? Clint, and then we'll come back to Rebecca again.
Just along with the priest thing, you got the reference to Melchizedek in there, and how that ties in with Jesus as high priest.
We're talking about you can't spell something more than one way. I used to know, and I was even, as I was reading again this morning, I was trying to say, Jeff, remember how to spell that, and then I've breathed since then, so I forgot how to spell things. Miss Rebecca?
Hebrews 5 says, these are people that have been Christians for a while. He said, by now you ought to be teachers, but you need someone else to teach you the principles. So they were like babes in Christ. So that was hard when all the morning and following the way that were not knowledgeable.
There's some maturity issues here. When we talk about that, is that idea of these are things that they should have known by now. Whoever the author is addressing them, he obviously knows his audience, and he says this, I don't think, as just some random third party not knowing people, but it seems as somebody who knows these folks saying, I really want to talk about this right now, but I can't do that until I go back and cover some things, and really I should be able to get into this me. And so that should be something that stands out to us as well. We'll talk about that. We get to there in chapter 5 and chapter 6 a little bit as well. Thanks. Jeff?
There are some pretty scary warnings in there, but overall, I think it's a book that's encouraging. It lays out the beauty of heaven, the greatness of our reward for faithful. And it's not disgusting.
Excuse me. Some perseverance language in there. The idea of both sides of the warnings with the encouragement, the thought of don't fall away, stick with it. Or the times we talk about stick with it or else you're in danger of falling away. A lot of those ideas are either right next to each other, or at least the thoughts can complement one another, even if they're not right next to each other in the text at that particular moment. What else do we know about Hebrews? Or our back right corner, anything thoughts about the book of Hebrews, things we know, things that we think we know?
It establishes Jesus as king. I don't know if that's already been said, but it establishes Jesus as king. Talks about the heroes of faith.
There we go. Connected to that up there. You following all this, Tracy? It's all very clearly laid out and no confusion at all here, right? What else about Hebrews? Dan, is that the start of a hand? Not right now. Mom, was that the start of a hand? Oh, okay. Miss Rebecca and then Dad.
It's a fearful thing. God is God of wrath, and He's the God of fire. And there's a fearful expectation we should fall away. Possibly to not be removed again, and to fall into the hands of a God who is consuming fire.
This fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I think that's there in Hebrews chapter 10. Those thoughts from chapter 6 that are always going to be well, I have a question about something here. It says that, if you leave Christ, you can't return. I thought that we couldn't always continually. We'll talk about what that means, but the thought of if we make the choice, we continue to walk in that choice, especially if we've already tasted Christ, and we choose to reject that. 2 Peter talks about that a little bit in 2 Peter 2 as well, that if you've been a Christian and you leave that behind, what else could convince you? If you're not a Christian, you have this great picture of Jesus is better. Oh, great, then I'd go to that. But if you've seen the Jesus is better arguments and you're thinking, never mind, I'm going to agree with that, what better thing argument could you have or go back to? Not impossible, but very much difficult. Barrett?
We pretty much said it, and it's basically in that superior, but just fulfillment. The
to these Hebrews, you know, all the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. I mean, it wasn't pointless. Jesus is superior, so it's not like that's just totally irrelevant. It's just he fulfilled it. So it's, you know, I don't know how better to say that.
Excuse me, yeah, you're right with that. There's a big use of the Old Testament.
Yeah, there's a ton of quotes.
Ton of quotes. I mean, if you're excuse me, translators are some of those, or the editors of whatever Bible version you're using or reading from is one of those people that indents quotes. You're going to have a lot of indentation going on as you're reading Hebrews. And we'll want to see not just, okay, he's using Old Testament, but we're going to want to do our best to say, okay, what is he using here? What's the meaning of that as best and as much as we can as we're going through all of this? Dad, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, just after chapter 11, the discussion on faith, chapter 12 gives them the encouragement to not grow weary.
So there's some encouragement, don't grow weary. What's our Hebrews 12, 1 or 2 statement we're supposed to do? I'm pointing at you, Ms. Ronna, because you bring it up sometimes in our class. We're supposed to fixing our eyes on Jesus. That's there in Hebrews 12. Jeff?
You were asking what genre of literature is it. To me, it sounds a lot like a transcript of a debate or like a lawyer arguing a case. It's sort of like, well, you've got these Jews over here saying that Jesus is nobody and that the law saves you, and then he goes point by point and contradicts all of the objections.
Some of those things in there, he's similar to how sometimes Paul will do something like that in making arguments, but you do see there's something about angels, let's talk about Jesus is better than angels. Something about Moses and Joshua, let's talk about Jesus is better than Moses and Joshua. Something about the Aaronic priesthood, the Old Covenant. Those first 10 chapters are really just kind of the author here making claims and making the points to say, here's Jesus' superiority even in those things. And those things having their roles or having their places in God's plan. When the author's talking about the Old Covenant, you've got our showdown up here, wherever it is. It's not talking about, it's irrelevant. It's talking about where are we now and what is each doing with each other. But he's very much not just saying, y'all dummies, just accept what I'm saying. He's going to give arguments and reasons for things, and we need to follow those arguments and reasons. Hopefully we're a place that we can start to have that maturity to talk about those things as well, wherever that is talked about. So Rebecca, another hand?
Chapter 9, but other places, the Old Testament is a type of what is coming. Christ is the fulfillment. The types, they didn't use the word, the types and antitypes.
Right, we've probably had studies like that. You've done studies like that before, the type, anti-type, those things of the tabernacle, the holy, the holiest of holies, all that stuff that had to be purified with blood. How does Jesus do that in the heavenly realm? Something we need to have discussions about and think about. But type, anti-type, we'll just summarize it like that. Miss Rebecca said a lot of better things than what I'm remembering now because I was paying attention, but also, I guess, not paying attention. I'm sorry, Miss Rebecca. Of putting stuff up here. But we'll think of type, anti-type. Yes, sir, Brother Roy. God's mind through the prophets, and God revealed his mind and how God has spoken. We've seen in the past he's done it through prophets. And we pay attention to his words through there and see what he has said, see how that fulfillment leads to how he has spoken to us in his Son, Christ. Other things about the book of Hebrews. Patrick.
Jesus is also called apostle.
We're going to have to... I thought there were only 12 apostles. We now have to break a whole Bible class about what is this talking about. We'll talk about that when we get there. P-O-S-L-E. I'm not going to put that in quotations, but we have that word being used. We'll talk about what's being said there with that. Excuse me. Again, I'm trying to maybe push some more verses we know. Our verse for why we have to be here that's not the best way to phrase that, but that's found somewhere in Hebrews. What's that verse saying? What's that talking about? And what's not forsaking the assembly is talked about in here. And why do we not forsake the assembly? The idea of encouragement is what's that connected to, as well as some warning of, if you do, there's a danger with that. 25. Miss Rebecca? You had another hand a sec? You don't have to, but I thought you had another one.
I believe, if I remember correctly, there are 12 statements in Hebrews. They either start with, therefore let us, or they just start out with, let us. So very specific exhortations, starting with the very same kind of conclusion, therefore, let us. Draw near, let us come to the throne of God, let us look to Jesus. Let us run with patience the race set before us.
The author makes his arguments, makes some points, as well as telling his audience, here's what you've got to do with that. And this is what it means about why you need to stay faithful and persevere even through some suffering that's going on, some persecution, and some dangers of if you don't follow these warnings. Ms. Glenda?
Brotherly love is in there also. Actually, probably, I would categorize it probably as a social duty or
We may come back to talk more about, as we'll see those things, but if you're facing persecution, may either be you get a little bit snippety with your brethren, or you can get tighter with your brethren. What we're going to do in those circumstances where we're facing that persecution. Jeff?
Well, I thought somebody else had already said this, but I'll speak after the copy. It was written to Hebrews.
So we've talked about people who are Christians, but we've got people who obviously come from Jewish backgrounds, it seems.
Well, I mean, Greeks and Romans would give a flip to Abraham, or why we have to prove to them all this stuff about the law.
There's obviously some connections to the old law. There's lots of arguments made from the old law that are pointing to Jesus. So they obviously are going to have some type of Jewish background or flavor, or at least knowledge of those scriptures as well. Along with that, I can ask someone with the board to just getting an estimate on our board. Where are we in the timeline? So we're in the first century. As far as major verses in the first century, where are we approximately date-wise? That's what we're looking for here, the idea of probably out of space. There are some statements we'll look at, actually in here in just a moment, that seem to connect to the idea of sacrifices are still being offered, the temple is still there. He's kind of almost seems to be pointing to, maybe this writer is somewhere kind of focusing on Christians in the Syria, the Palestine area of things. It does not specifically said with that, but the way he's pointing to, you see the sacrifice, you see the temple, you see all of this, probably before 70 AD when the temple is destroyed. Anything else we want to add to our clear-cut board up here? Anything else we know about the book of Hebrews that we can come back to later? I guess we've kind of hit that. I was going to say, what's the point? We've got warning and perseverance, connection to faith. Anything else we need to add before we get a couple of short introduction things before we close this morning? Ms. Rebecca.
I guess you go to chapter 13, it's in specific direction to people. You're supposed to offer a sacrifice of your lips to God. It says you're to obey your leaders. It seems that there's really no audience to talk to him personally, so he had to think out that audience.
We get some of those things in there to talk about, even though the author may not be identified specifically, might have some guesses. You're more than welcome to have your assumptions of who wrote Hebrews. Those are probably conversations we'd like to keep outside of 9:30 to 10:20, if we can do that for the next 4 months. But we might see some clues for some of that within there. Tracy? Last thing.
Just kind of stacking on top of what we said about Target and written to, it seems like it's one last attempt to reach out to the Jews to convert them. It was an encouragement to, the gospel is offered to the Jews first, but they're getting one more opportunity. Here's why, and just one more opportunity to become a Christian if you are still part of that old law. And it was an opportunity to try to convert the Jews one last time, is what I'm reading as I see all this on the board.
Maybe kind of a little bit of apologetics somewhere in there, or kind of making a reason of, if you're not a Christian, here's why you should be a Christian. Maybe imagine almost any inspired book is going to have some of that as well.
Like everything's better. Everything here is better, and you know what all that's for, and this is still better. I just see it as one last opportunity to pull the Jews into the kingdom.
We're cutting it after this. Last thing, go ahead.
Hebrews chapter 12, especially starting in verse 18, I know you said don't look, but it says, for you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and darkness, and gloom, and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet, and the sound of words. It sounds with such that those who heard beg that no further word be spoken to them, for they cannot bear the command. If even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly, the church of the firstborn, who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling of blood, who speaks better things than the blood of Abel. So the phenomenal position that we are in compared to what they were in the Old Testament. So we are much superior.
Our position being this side of the cross, the resurrection, all the things that were accomplished in the heavenly realm because of what Jesus has done, kind of being led up in a great crescendo there into chapter 12. So with this information, again, just wanting to get, as you've read Hebrews over the past week, what are some things that you've remembered, some things that stood out to you, maybe in other places as well? We want to especially be noting this idea that Jesus is superior. We're talking about that a lot. I think that's kind of a key theme of the book. We'll be talking about these warnings from this board, the encouragement. I feel like a lot of the things are going to end up falling into that idea. We're going to see our use of the Old Testament talked about as well. And obviously other things that are up here will be relevant too, but we'll see how do they fit into some of these places, some of these sections. Just to get a few things I wanted to make sure we had on same page together for our introduction class this morning in our last 10 minutes or so. Hebrews chapter 13, if you haven't been looking at Hebrews, maybe encouraged you a little while ago, go ahead and open your Bibles to Hebrews. Let's start in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 22. This is always the passage when we think about what is this, what's the genre, what's the letter, what is the setting and all of this. The writer tells us in Hebrews 13:22, I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation. There's an exhortation that's being made here, and as the ESV has it at the end of this, for I have written to you briefly. You know, if it takes 45 minutes to read this letter, I don't know if I would call that briefly, but that's kind of the joke aside of all of this, to understand that he's making some of these points and trying to type pack them to say some things you need to know about Jesus, and some warnings and some encouragements that go with all of that as well. What we know about the author, a couple of things we want to draw. Go to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3 and verse 4. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3 and verse 4. I don't plan on mentioning any specific names over the next few months about author names. If you say Paul says, and you quote a passage from Hebrews, I'm not going to jump at you in class, but that would be something that some people may say those at times or have those thoughts. And again, you're more than welcome to have those thoughts and reasons. Some things we see from the letter, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3 and verse 4. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Some people see this to be here of this writer not being one of like the original apostles or maybe one of the original disciples of Jesus, but someone who has heard from the testimony of those disciples, as well as understanding with all of this too, that this is an inspired person, the fact that we have Hebrews for us and that we study this book as the Word of God, divinely inspired. Maybe they may not have been a specific eyewitness to Jesus originally, but they have heard those testimonies, and they've been inspired by the Spirit to write this letter to Christians, some encouragement, some warnings they needed to hear. Some other things found in chapter 13, particularly in verses 22 through 25. We read about that brief word of exhortation. In verse 23, you should know that our brother Timothy has been set released, with whom I shall see you if he comes again soon. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those who come from Italy send you greetings. Grace be with you all. Again, this author very well seems to be familiar with his audience and knows them. He mentions Timothy, which I don't know how common Timothy was of a name back in that time, but most people are at least going to make the seems safe assumption to say that Timothy is probably 1st and 2nd Timothy and Acts 16 and 17 and 2nd and 3rd missionary journeys kind of Timothy, Paul and Timothy, that kind of guy who's being mentioned there, so maybe has some knowledge and connections with him. The audience appears to be facing or either has gone through or is currently going through some persecution and suffering. In chapter 10, verse 32 through verse 39. But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. You have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. My righteous shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and persevere their soul and preserve their souls. The idea, you see some reference to some sufferings in there, so the fact that they've been going through those sufferings, maybe they've encouraged others who have gone through sufferings before. Now they're kind of at a testing or a potential breaking point. Some of these people are starting to break and say, I'm not dealing it anymore. It's been years and Jesus doesn't come back, and I've been going through this maybe for years and for a long time, and I'm done and I'm walking away. Maybe they're trying to go back to the law, maybe they're just done in general. And the writer's trying to tell them, don't quit. But rather than being those who would shrink back from this, continue to lead by faith, just like Habakkuk was told and like God told Habakkuk. We'll talk about the context of that, but think about that context. If here's a man who knows that God's judgment is coming, but ends up having that, I will still trust in the Lord and still have faith in what he is going to do and accomplish with his will. Some warning passages are mentioned, passages like chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, 10, 12. I may have even missed some of those. We'll talk about those warnings. Those are warnings to these people, things that they should not fall away or go back to the ways of the world or leave Christ behind. Those are warnings very much relevant to you and me, too. Whether we're currently facing suffering or whether we're just tired out and worn out, maybe the enemy is trying to get us to focus on other things outside of Christ, and we're diminishing some of his superiority. And so we need to have that encouragement. What happens if we leave Christianity behind? And we need to pay attention to those warnings. And ultimately, it seems that theme, Jesus is superior or better or greater. We have these examples in chapters 1 and 2, roughly, Jesus being better than angels. Chapters 3 and 4, Jesus is better than Moses and Joshua. Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 is just one of my favorite sections, the idea of talking about the people of Israel in their time in the wandering in the wilderness and how they rejected the voice of God. The Hebrew writer saying, are you going to be one of those people who voices the reject of God? Think about the rest that's laid up for you. There's some great connections to the Old Testament and what we should draw from those stories and what it applies to our life and how we continue to go on this walk and go on this journey until we find that promised rest That's promised to us as well. Remind us of the promises of God as we look at places like that. Jesus is superior to the Aaronic priesthood, to the Old Covenant. Again, these are some things we've also talked about up here. Here's some pictures, as well as some final encouragement of faith and perseverance, some final warnings as well in that last section. An outline like this, maybe hit some key themes. Those aren't hard lines. I don't think when the Hebrew writer was writing Hebrews, he says, okay, for these 3 chapters, I'm only talking about this. But these get us maybe some pictures. In fact, if you're thinking about pictures, there are groups like the Bible Project that illustrate things. I enjoy some of their drawings. I'm sure you can see all of these details very clearly, right, Retta? You see all of that perfectly from the back there. But you can find stuff like this, and it gives outlines of the book that might be helpful for you to look at or refer to over time. Hebrews will be our focus for the next few months. Like I said, Lord willing, through the month of January, we'll be in this book. I plan next week to have a book reading. I know I've been encouraging you to read it, but I think about as oftentimes these letters would have been delivered, there would have been a time that they would have taken the whole thing together. So before we start breaking things down, let's think about some of the things we know about Hebrews. Kind of remember this board in mind. I don't think I can pull this out every week. I'm not going to make Mike drag this with me from that back classroom and stick it back in that back classroom constantly. But we'll take a picture of this, and I'll take a picture of this at least. And at the end of our study, we'll come back to, here's are the things we talked about we think we know in Hebrews, or the presuppositions we have, or the ideas. Have we seen those things, and have we noticed those things? And if we have, hopefully we've been moving in the right direction. Or what other evidences are we seeing from the study as well? So after we get through a reading, the following week we'll start to break down the book. We're going to attempt to do chapters per class. If we don't, it's okay, right? It's okay. That's okay. That's for me, not for you. It's okay if we don't get a whole chapter in class. I've heard about 1st and 2nd Corinthians from Tyler Sams. Or I think I've heard about you all talk about 1st and 2nd Corinthians from Tyler Sams. I don't think we'll have another one of those. Not that that's a bad thing, but anyway, we'll leave that at that. Any other final comments about Hebrews before we leave? Jeff?
A lot of people here remember Paul Kelsey. I knew him a long time. He was a preacher here, and I knew him then. But this was his favorite book, and a lot of times he talked about the grandeur of the language and how that it impressed you with what a noble and holy thing it is to do.
Those are things that we'll see. We know, whether we can remember that and think about that, but we'll see those things from the book as well to see the author talking about. These are not trite, trivial. The author is not just trying to debate to win a debate. He's trying to make some very important and grand points that are significant to us, not just in my own little life, but in the big plans of the world and what God has accomplished and done. We need to pay attention to the reverence, the majesty of those wonderful, magnificent things. So we'll pick up next week with a reading. I encourage you to come. We'll maybe have a couple of short comments. I know I generally talk fast. I'm going to try to read at an average pace, and that should get us about 45 minutes through the book. So if we start about 9:32 or so, about 10:47 or 10:17, we should be about done with the whole thing. And we can see what is the whole picture? What are all these arguments the author is making? I think that's a valuable thing for a church family to do. So that's our plan for next week, Lord willing. But our class is done for now. This will be a first bell. So don't go running through the halls, even though the kids go run through our halls for our class afterwards sometimes. Let's not disturb them as they wrap up as well. Get to visit with one another. Thank you so much for being here, for your participation this morning.